Paul and Janine laid out who the oaks are of the Americas and where they are. I'm going to go a little bit more into the functional side of how they're surviving the different environments that they're in, and this is over a Common Garden Studies. But the big ideas, and I've been able to build on this work over the past few years. We've had a lot of severe droughts just in the Americas, or just in the U.S., but with ESA 2011 down in Texas, there was over 60 days of temperatures that never got below 90 degrees. They forecasted about 50% of the trees were going to die, and that was in central Texas. And then 2012, it was more than 60% of the U.S. that had severe drought. And then the prolonged droughts in California, unlike anything other that they've seen before, with a long-term drought, but also very warm temperatures. And the combination there is forecasting 1 billion trees to die. And it's mostly, they give examples of oaks being very tolerant for drought in California, but they're now labeling in the news that even the oaks are starting to show signs of succumbing to the droughts. And things are going to probably get worse. It's forecasted that these drought frequencies and severities are going to increase. So it's pertinent to try to press on this and try to figure out how species are going to be able to adapt to these different conditions, but also which ones are currently. And water is vital for maintaining structure and turgor of the tissue, photosynthesis and respiration, metabolism. And so plants can survive these different environments a couple different ways. There's isohydry, where a plant is trying to maintain the same water status within the leaf or in its tissue, and that's kind of an avoidance or escape method. And then there's anisohydry, where a plant can change its water status within the plant, and that is a way to tolerate it or have some resistance. And I'll give you some detail there. So an avoidance strategy, a species might, in the growing season or in any drought conditions, it would close its stomata, try to maintain its water potential, and it might drop leaves to try to reduce the amount of area it has that would possibly cause water to go out of the plant. That's a risk of carbon starvation under long-term drought, though. If a plant's closing its stomata or dropping its leaves, it's not going to be able to fix carbon. And if that's a long drought, you could start losing woody tissue or the whole plant itself if it doesn't have enough carbon to maintain metabolism. And then resistance traits, you could have something more of like the plant's going to try to maintain its canopy as best it can, but as the soil is drying down, it has to change its solute potential. It has to change the concentration of solutes within its tissues to be able to osmotically adjust, pull water up from the ground, and keep its stomates open, be able to fix carbon at least in some conditions that are favorable. But there's going to be a high cost, just like what we speculated with freezing tolerance. It's a higher cost to the tissue to be able to withstand cavitation of that low water potential, and then also formation of solutes. And also forming leaves that can handle the desiccation risks. So go just a basic background, just so a primer to make sure everybody's up to the same level here of looking at turgor loss points and leaf water potential. So a plant cell can change its water status, how much water is within a cell by changing its number of solutes, or either inorganic or organic solutes. It could be proline, or it could be sugars. It could also be inorganic. There's some elements that it can scavenge, and that can cause the osmotic potential to change, allow the osmotic adjustment and pull more water up. And this will allow the tissue to hydrate. And this can prevent wilting, a critical wilting point where a plant loses its ability to come back from a wilting condition. So with turgor loss point up at the top there, if The idea there is to try to understand what the minimum drawdown is that you could have on a plant tissue before it can never come back from and rehydrate itself. That's all based on when you lose 50% of your conductance in the leaf tissue. And as if you take a hydrated leaf and you dry it down, its leaf water potential will get lower and lower, or more hydrated. And the inflection point, you typically could, under a long, laborious process, figure this out where the trigger loss point is. But you could also, using some new methods by Megan Bartlett, look to figure out what its saturated solute concentration is. And that's closely related to it, and you can try to relate it to the trigger loss point. So I'll talk a lot about this later on. It's been an important finding for relating to the oaks. But again, we already see we have a good idea of where these two clades are, the two big ones, the reds and the whites here in the Americas, but we see them overlap, and they cover a big, broad range of environment. But the parallel diversification is an interesting replication, an interesting study to be able to look at with these species, that they're occupying the same niche. They're occupying the same ranges, and they've done this at the same time. So they may have possibly evolved the same traits at the same time, or they've had them ancestrally in their DNA to be able to deal with these different environments. So trying to tackle these questions with this clade is really interesting and useful. And some of the base data I'll use for a lot of the talk here and a lot of the analyses was looking at where the species are growing, and they cover this whole range. They're obviously not in the Mountain West here, but they cover a really broad range of temperature. The American Southeast is pretty uniform, but Mexico, I'm covering up part of it, sorry. That's a really tight range of different temperatures here, and out in California also. And then from that, you can determine what the potential evapotranspiration is. So based on the latitude, you get different day lengths, and based on the temperature, you can calculate the potential evapotranspiration that's useful for the amount of water stress that's going to be on a plant. And then precipitation is the amount of how much you're going to quench the water stress that's going on for a plant. And during, this is just annual precipitation, so mean annual precipitation, but between these two, potential evapotranspiration and precipitation, you can calculate a drought stress, and this has been a really useful metric that is from Erica Edwards. I give you an idea of the amount of precipitation, amount of potential evapotranspiration, and you can quantify the water stress for a different area. But if you look at May through August, and these are all the oaks that we have for the Americas, about 135,000 data points that we were able to glean from herbarium records and some of our own records. We're able to see the more xeric environments are lighter colors here. So California, the Arizona and some desert areas here, and then going into more mesic environments in the southeast, into Mexico, but in Mexico you can cover the whole broad range. So this has been really useful to capture what the native range drought stress is for these species. And so we took an average per species, 135 species I think are captured in this data set. We were able to infer what the native climate is for each of these species and relate it to some of the other physical traits that we've measured in the greenhouse. So some of the big questions, hypotheses of how these plants could do well, basic hypotheses we'll work through. Try to think about the idea that mesic environments should allow a plant to have really high growth rates, have traits that are well suited for competitive growth, and be able to take advantage of the well-watered conditions. And then xeric species should have strategies and traits to avoid mortality. They should have higher solute concentrations to change its osmotic potential, have ability to draw water when things dry down, and ways to prevent mortality or death of tissue that is going to be useful to be able to fix carbon in the future. And then the big question we wanted to look at, and this is a fundamental question that hadn't been investigated to this extent before, is there a trade-off between the ability to have drought tolerance and growth rates? So the plants that are developing solutes or tissue that can withstand dry conditions, are they not able to grow as fast as a plant that might be more adapted to mesic environments? So to look at this question, we had a 3-year common garden, or 2 years. It's on its third, so we have some plants to give away if anybody needs some. It pains me to toss them out. So, but we were able to get a really good collection from across the Americas, and we also have some Costa Rican and Honduras species. So yeah, we were able to grow these all in common garden at the University of Minnesota, and cover representation across the clades that we saw earlier. And as a split plot design, we have temperate and tropical rooms. That didn't play out to be as important, but we also had 3 different water treatments, so low, medium, high watering treatments, really deep pots to let the plants grow. We had to cut the bottoms of the pots off and stack them on top of another pot, because they don't make a pot that's good for growing oaks this long. But we tried to resolve that to get into this. And we measured the heck out of these plants in the second growing season. So after 1 year, we started the water treatments. And we had a team of researchers with me, the students that I was training, and we went through and dug into a lot of physiological and morphological traits, and one of the big ones I'll focus on is this osmolarity. And we were able to understand how the different species responded to these watering treatments and what their growth rates were using allometry. So we on a separate greenhouse study, we harvested tissues and have a good representation just from above ground traits what the total biomass of a plant is. So the watering treatments, every time the soil moisture dropped below 7% or 14% or 21%, we watered them to saturation. So we were just giving them a heavy watering, just like a heavy rainfall would be. But what it ended up being is at very different intervals of water. But the bigger the plants were, the faster they'd go through water. So you'd have to adjust that timing based on the size of the plant. And we were doing all those measurements with time domain reflectivity, and we had significant differences between those water treatments, between the low and the high, and those are the ones I'm going to emphasize the most when I'm presenting some of the results here. But we see differences in the growth rates and the dieback between these treatments, and it holds up really well. But if anybody has questions about any of the other measurements I won't get to, or this osmolarity rapid determination of solutes, it's really useful, much faster to do than traditional pressure bomb tests. And you can do about 25 samples a day, but it does take some energy to do. You have to hydrate the plants. That's harder to do for easier to say than do. For 40 species of oaks that we were growing, some of them would hydrate after you water them in 2 hours. The leaf would be back to zero water potential, but other ones you could water them 36 hours every 2 hours, and the leaf would never hydrate down to a zero that you would expect in some of the standard protocols. So some species like Odoloides, they would hydrate really quickly, but other ones like Chrysolepis, they would take a really long time to get fully hydrated. But if you hydrate a plant, you harvest the leaf pre-dawn, you put in an envelope with some wet piece of paper, keep everything moist, and you run this as a sample within 12 hours, you can get a really good representation of what the solutes are within that leaf. You have to freeze the leaf after you take a punch, put in liquid nitrogen, and you lyse the cell. You're able to get all the solutes, the osmolates, out of the tissue and put it into this vapro machine to be able to get the determination of what the solute concentrations are based on vapor pressure deficit. So the sample is thawed and frozen rapidly multiple times, and you're able to get a good estimation of that solute concentration. But harvesting everything pre-dawn, processing them for 12 hours, or within 12 hours, you become nocturnal for a month or two to go through as many samples as you want to go through. But we did a lot, and we got a lot done, and we were able to see some really good data. As the soil's drying down here at the x-axis, we see that the leaf water potential decreases. It probably could fit this better, but it's more of a shape like this, but also the solute concentrations are increasing as you dry this down. And this is the ambient values. So this is not hydrated. This is just going in and harvesting off the tissue before or while they're still in the water treatments that we started. And the relationship between that leaf water potential and soil moisture is fairly good. It's pretty good for ecology values. But then one of the big things that's useful to be able to say that relate this to Turgor loss point, this ambient and the saturated values. So we worked everything with ambient soil moisture, and then we hydrated everything we did as a saturated value. Those samples are related. So what that is an indication of is the historical soil conditions that the plants have been growing in remain as an artifact after you hydrate them. So the values are slightly smaller or lower, but in the saturated values, but they still show a relationship to what the soil conditions were. And these are some of the values, estimate of Turgor loss points. And as you dry down to it's 20% soil moisture, you're 1 there. So most of these values allow for some osmotic adjustment that the plants are still pulling up water. So we'll walk through the hypotheses. What we had is that the more mesic species, we expected to see them growing faster, having traits that have ability to have high competitive growth. And the idea here across the different treatments, all my axes are going to be the same in these figures, where you have more mesic species here where there's a surplus of water during the growing season, and these plants have a deficit in their native range. And so what we see is that there's differences between treatments and growth rates. The more water that's available, the higher the growth rates. And the more mesic species have a greater response or enhancement of growth in response to well-watered conditions. And the relative growth rate is the biomass change, grams of growth per gram of the plant per day. So this is over one growing season. So we see that enhancement of growth with water. We also see traits that would be related to growth rates. So stomatal pore index, Janine showed already. I have the clades here on the side, but we see this across the clades that there's the more mesic species have a higher stomatal pore index, a higher capacity to exchange gas and be able to fix carbon if it has its stomates open. One thing to note, and this popped up a lot, is the Varentes. They seem like they're this competitive growing machines. They had higher stomatal pore index values than the other clades, and that was a significant relationship there. But in most of the figures I'm going to show you is that these clades have the same patterns. It's across the clade that there's, and all these figures, we ran them just straight up, not paying attention to what the phylogeny was, and then also using phylogenetic independent contrast. And a lot of times those relationships improve these values. So removing the phylogenetic history improves some of the figures, but what it's showing is that there's these patterns are happening across the clades. Something we didn't expect, but we've heard some anecdotes since then, is that we did expect that the plants that under well-watered conditions would be fixing more carbon, but what we see is the carbon assimilation rate with using Lycor is higher in the Xeric species, under well water conditions. And they also have a lot of water loss while they're doing that. So they're fixing a lot of carbon, they're having a lot of water loss. So what that ends up being is that they have a lower water use efficiency. So for every gram of carbon that they're fixing, they're losing a lot more water. This is under well water conditions. They're opportunistic physiology. They're taking advantage of really well water conditions, but they're doing it in a sloppy way. So that their stomates are wide open, they're fixing a lot of carbon. And this, if you look at these figures in the low water treatments, these values all decrease, but the Xeric species have an increase in water use efficiency. So they change their strategy in a way that they are fixing carbon at a more efficient rate for the amount of water that they're losing. And then, I have a dot there. So the other things we wanted to look at with Xeric species, we were questioning if they had strategies that would allow them to withstand drought. And under low water conditions, we see that the more Xeric species have higher solute concentrations. So they're doing osmotic adjustment. They are retaining the ability to pull water in under low water conditions. With that higher solute concentrations, and that also relates to a decreased amount of stem dieback. So these negative values means that the amount of tissue that's lost in this proportion of the plants. Some plants really didn't do too well with drought conditions, where about half the plant died. But each of these points is one species. And what we see is a relationship across the native environments is that the Xeric species have higher solutes and they have less stem woody loss with low water conditions. And then this is the big one. We wanted to see if there was a trade-off between the ability to osmotically adjust or have higher solutes and growth rates. And what we see here is, and I'll emphasize right here, is that this is between the two different treatments. So what we have is high and low water treatment growth rates. So a 0 value means that there's no difference between growth rates between the low and the high water treatments. And then this value here means that the plants are enhanced with water, so that their growth rates are higher when there's more water. And what we see is that there's a trade-off between the solute accumulation and growth rates in these plants. And something that's really curious, to give two varieties right here, the middle state, and they retain their leaves. They're probably they're doing some osmotic adjustment, but they're not doing as much as some of these more Xeric species. And then down here we have these are all Mexican species, and they have some of the lowest values that we've seen. How do these relate to other species? We grew beech in our study also, American beech, Fagus grandifolia, and those had some of the highest values that we saw. So big conclusions that we were looking at and trying to figure out of this is that we see a lot of trait alignment between the plants and their native environment. So that more mesic species had more competitive growth traits or growth traits. We didn't measure competition, sorry. And then the more Xeric species have traits that are more aligned with Xeric environments and drought stress, or ability to withstand drought stress. The accumulation of solutes occurs more with drought stress, but the Xeric species also have higher solutes overall. And the solute potential ends up being a very useful metric for drought tolerance. And we see that there's a trade-off between those two. So that's more prominent in the Mexican species, or a lot of the Mexican species have really low solutes and higher growth rates, and more of the Xeric species that we were seeing didn't have enhanced growth with higher water. And future work we're hoping to dig into is more patterns of adaptation rates across the ranges in the phylogeny, and it's a really interesting question of what solutes are being produced or being developed and stored in these tissues. Is it proline, which would be nitrogen dependent, or is it sugars? And is that where the carbon's going that the extra Xeric species are producing? But those are the big things we're getting into right now. But That's it.